I'm Rachel Rosenfield Lafo. I'm the director of the Richmond Art Gallery, and I have a long career as a curator of contemporary art and writer about contemporary art. I'm here to talk about the exhibition Peter Aspell, the Mad Alchemist. The project was embarked with the West Vancouver Museum, and I'm here with my colleague Darrin Morrison, who's director-curator there.
Hello, I'm Darrin Morrison. I'm the director-curator of the West Vancouver Museum. I've been director there since 2005, and I've worked in public galleries and museums in Canada since 1987. As Rachel introduced the project, this is a collaborative project with two exhibitions. The West Vancouver Museum's exhibition is called Peter Aspell, Saints and Sinners, Mystics and Madness, and both shows open in January.
Peter Aspell was a painter primarily in Vancouver area. He was born in 1918 and lived until 2004. And he actually lived for almost 10 years in Richmond. And he stood apart from a lot of his contemporary artists, which is one of the reasons that we have focused on him for this exhibition, because we feel that he was under-recognized in the art community. The choice of work for the exhibition was, I found, challenging to a degree because the artist was so prolific. There was actually many works to choose from, and we both decided to limit our choice from the latter part of the artist's career, which we both felt was the strongest work. In the Richmond Art Gallery show, the works start in the late 1980s and go up to just before his death. And the earlier works in the show tend to have the more symbolic mythological references, which were a part of his work. He was very inspired by African art and East Indian art, and a lot of European painters inspired him. Then he did a series of X-ray paintings and a series that he called memory portraits, that were portraits, but they were based on memories of people, not specific portraits of individuals. So in the Richmond Art Gallery show, there's a range of work representing the kinds of series that he did. He did work in series throughout his career.
I think it's interesting to note that his use of color is of note, and yet despite his use of color, there was always, in some ways, a dark undercurrent in much of the work that he produced. And when I was selecting work for the show, the pieces that kind of stood out for us for that were works that he did that were based on a criticism of abuses of power. He grew up in a Catholic household and later rejected his religion, but I think he was imbued with a sense from that, and works in the show, as the title suggests, Saints and Sinners, includes sort of critical works about the abuse of power in the church and also in other aspects of life. So there are many portraits he did of admirals or industrialists. He did works that were sort of critical of sort of the blind pursuit of capitalism and the resulting pollution. Work in our show is called The Pollution Machine. And I think that that theme predominates, at least in our exhibition.
And actually in the Richmond Art Gallery exhibition, the painting called The Industrialist, which we've also used on the cover of the catalog, definitely represents that theme of this giant head of this industrialist, and there's factory chimneys spewing out polluted air and other little figures that represent the sort of working class. So that was, yes, a recurrent theme. When I mentioned that Peter Aspell was inspired by many artists, particularly artists from European art history, like the Spanish painter Velázquez, who did a series in the 17th century of dwarf paintings. And actually the painting that's behind us here, The Imprisoned Dwarf, is one of a series of paintings that Aspell did of dwarves in different situations, inspired, I think, by Velázquez, but they take off on a very personal direction for him. And I just want to comment that Darrin's comment about color, I think you can see it in the painting behind us. It's incredibly intense, layered, rich colors, the thick way that they're applied with other colors showing through. He really was an exceptional colorist, even though we both have paintings in our exhibitions that have a darker tone to them as well. Regarding the relevance of Peter Aspell's work to contemporary painting, I think there's a renewed interest in the materiality of painting. There have been a lot of exhibitions recently that focus on paint as a material substance, and Peter Aspell was all about that. There are many quotes, some of which appear in the catalog, where he talks about the pleasures of walking and touching paint and manipulating paint. And again, I think all you have to do is look at the paintings and you see that he had a love and an expertise in handling paint. So I think his interest in the materiality is something that's very relevant to contemporary painting today. And the other thing that's coming back into the picture is a little bit of emotion in the work, where I think some of the work in the Vancouver area was very intellectual and deliberately did not have emotional references. Peter Aspell's work is all about expressionism and emotion, and I think that is reemerged in some areas of contemporary art, and there is a connection.
Peter often made references, other cultural references or art historical references in his work, and there are a couple of pieces I think of note in the shows. There's one in our show called The Fairy Boatman, and it references Greek mythology and the transition between life and death and being ferried across the river Styx by Charon. And I think the piece is an interesting metaphor for Peter's work and the sort of journey that the shows will take us on. There's another work in our show called X-Ray of Cardinal de Guevara, and it's an overt reference to a painting by El Greco of one of the leaders of the Spanish Inquisition. And in Peter's depiction of the cardinal, he shows sort of the X-ray, the sort of the inner workings of the cardinal, and also surrounded in flames. And again, his sort of criticism of abuse of power, and there's a direct or overt reference in that work.
Well, there's a painting in the Richmond Art Gallery show called Narcissus, which is a figure from Greek mythology. And many people know the Narcissus myth, but a young, beautiful man who looks at his own reflection in a pool and is so enamored with his own looks that, there are different spins to the story, how it ends, but ultimately he drowns or he dies as a result of his sort of fascination with himself. And but in the Peter Aspell rendition of this painting, which is clearly based on a Caravaggio painting on the same subject in terms of its composition, it's a robot looking at the human who's underwater. And this is part of the series of the robot paintings. So there's a quote that we use of Peter's in the catalog where he talks about where is society heading, basically. I'm paraphrasing here. If we all turn into robots, what's going to happen to us? And then the robots, as we've said, were a factor in many of the other paintings, including the very important triptych that's in our show called March of the Machines. Peter Aspell was also very interested in African art. There were a number of years, he had his own art school in Vancouver that he ran for a number of years, and he would often take some of his students on trips to New York City to visit galleries and museums. And there was an African art gallery that he always visited. He collected African art. So even though he never was able to travel to Africa, he was knowledgeable about the symbols and the cultures and incorporated a lot of the iconography from that culture into his artworks. The painting in our show, Niger 12, incorporates some African masks and other symbols. And then there's a later painting called The Pharaoh, which again, of course, is based on the subject of a pharaoh. There's a Cleopatra painting. So he was very interested in not only African art, but just historical figures, religious figures, as Darrin has said. But they became for him archetypes. They weren't the real person. He was not interested in creating realistic portraits that you could recognize as the person. It was more they became symbols, whether it was symbols of a power, symbols of a marginalized person in society like a dwarf or a clown figure. And I think for me, that's one of the most interesting things about his works is that they're figurative, but they're universal.